Sergeant James Holliday was a man of discipline, respect, and authority, or so he believed. His entire career, spanning over 20 years in law enforcement, had been defined by his sharp attention to detail, his unwavering loyalty to the badge, and a stern demeanor that earned him respect from his peers. Holliday considered himself a model officer, someone who upheld the law with an iron fist, believing that the world was black and white, right and wrong, no grey areas. He was known as a man who didn't tolerate nonsense, a cop who always got the job done. But there was another side to Holliday, a side that he wasn't even fully aware of, lurking beneath his rigid professional exterior, deep-seated prejudice. Over the years, his encounters with certain communities, particularly African-American ones, had fostered a sense of superiority in him. He often dismissed their complaints, ignored their concerns, and saw them as people who were constantly at odds with the law. He wasn't overtly racist in his actions, but his bias was there, simmering just below the surface, influencing his every decision. Holliday convinced himself that his approach was justifiable. After all, he was enforcing the law, and people had to be held accountable. On this particular day, Holliday was out on patrol, driving through a quiet neighborhood that had recently undergone significant changes. What had once been a modest community had transformed into an upscale enclave for the wealthy, with pristine lawns, newly constructed homes, and expensive cars parked in freshly paved driveways. Holliday always felt a sense of satisfaction cruising through these neighborhoods, a reassurance that everything was in order, that the right kind of people were living there. As he turned a corner onto a narrow, tree-lined street, his attention was caught by an older model car slowly making its way down the road. It didn't belong. He knew this without having to think twice. The car wasn't flashy, it wasn't new, and it certainly didn't fit the image of the affluent residents who had recently moved into the area. Behind the wheel sat Marion Jackson, a woman who carried her 72 years with quiet dignity. She was composed, thoughtful, and carried herself with the grace of someone who had seen the world change around her many times over. Her face, framed by neatly braided grey hair, bore the lines of both joy and hardship. Marion wasn't someone who demanded attention, but her presence always commanded respect. She was on her way to visit her granddaughter, a trip she had been looking forward to for months. Her granddaughter had recently moved to this neighborhood after getting a promotion at work, and Marion had promised to come and see her once she had seen her. Driving wasn't something that intimidated Marion. Despite her age, she had always been independent, taking pride in her ability to move around freely. She navigated the roads with caution, respecting every traffic rule, mindful of her surroundings. Today was no different. As she turned into the quiet residential street, Marion noticed the police cruiser in her rearview mirror, but she didn't think much of it. She had done nothing wrong. Holliday's eyes narrowed as he focused on Marion's car. "What is she doing here?" he muttered to himself, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. It didn't make sense to him. An older black woman driving through this part of town, something about it just didn't sit right with him. Was she lost? Was she casing the neighborhood? Holliday's suspicions began to bubble up as his ingrained bias took over. Without even realizing it, he made a judgment about Marion based solely on her appearance and her car. He decided to follow her. For a few blocks, Holliday tailed Marion's car, watching her every move. Marion, meanwhile, began to feel uneasy. The police cruiser had been behind her for longer than seemed normal. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run any lights or stop signs, and she certainly wasn't breaking any laws. But still, the police car remained close behind. Holliday's mind raced as he continued to follow her. He convinced himself that something wasn't right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she was up to something. His suspicions, baseless and irrational, took root, and before long, he made up his mind he was going to pull her over. After all, it was his job to make sure this neighborhood stayed safe. With a quick flick of his lights, Holliday signaled for Marion to pull over. Marion sighed, her heart sinking as the red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. She slowed the car and carefully guided it to the side of the road. As she came to a stop, she took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She had done nothing wrong. This was probably just a routine stop, and if she stayed polite and cooperative, everything would be fine. But Holiday didn't see it that way. As he stepped out of his cruiser and approached Marion's car, his hand instinctively rested on his holster. His face was set in a grim expression as he peered through the window at the elderly woman behind the wheel. License and registration, he barked, not bothering to introduce himself or explain why he had stopped her. Marion's eyes widened slightly at the harshness in his voice. "Good afternoon, officer," she said calmly, reaching for her purse. "Is there a problem?" I said, "License and registration," Holiday repeated, more forcefully this time, ignoring her question. Marion handed him her documents, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She had been through enough in her life to know how to handle situations like this. "I'm just on my way to visit my granddaughter," she explained, her voice steady. "She lives in this neighborhood." Holiday barely glanced at her paperwork before turning his gaze back to her. "You don't look like you belong here," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "What are you really doing in this neighborhood?" Marion frowned, her calm demeanor starting to crack. "I'm visiting my family," she repeated, her voice firm but polite. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer." But Holiday wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind about her, and no amount of reasoning was going to change that. Holiday stared at Marion for a moment longer, his hand still hovering near his holster, as if he were expecting trouble. His mind raced through a series of irrational suspicions, fueled by the stereotypes that had been ingrained in him for years. He didn't trust her, despite having no valid reason to. Her age, her calm demeanor, none of it mattered. In his eyes, she was out of place, and that made her a problem. Without another word, he signaled for her to step out of the vehicle. Marion, feeling the tension in the air thickening, hesitated for a moment before slowly unbuckling her seatbelt. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, standing next to her car. She kept her posture straight, holding herself with quiet dignity, but inside she felt a growing sense of unease. "Is there something wrong, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Holiday didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked around her car, inspecting it as if he were searching for anything to justify his actions. He circled it twice, his expression hard and suspicious, before returning to stand in front of Marion. "You were driving a bit slow back there," he said, his tone accusing. "What are you hiding?" Marion blinked, confused. "I wasn't speeding, officer. I was driving carefully because I'm not familiar with this area." "You were acting suspicious," Holiday pressed on, ignoring her explanation. "Do you have anything illegal in the car? Weapons? Drugs?" Marion's heart sank. She had heard stories about encounters like this, where innocent people were harassed for no reason other than the color of their skin. She never thought she'd find herself in such a situation. But here she was. Still, she tried to stay calm, reminding herself that she had nothing to hide. "No, officer," she said firmly. "I'm just a grandmother driving to see my granddaughter. I have nothing illegal in my car." But Holiday wasn't convinced. His bias had taken over completely, and in his mind, Marion's calmness was just a front. He was determined to find something wrong. "Step back," he ordered, his voice sharp as he moved toward the car. "I'm going to search your vehicle." Marion's eyes widened in shock. "Search my vehicle? On what grounds? I haven't done anything wrong." Holiday's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "Step back, Mom. Now." Marion could feel her pulse quicken. This was wrong, and she knew it. She hadn't broken any laws, and there was no reason for her to be treated like this. But she also knew that arguing with a police officer could make things worse. Reluctantly, she took a step back, watching helplessly as Holiday began rummaging through her car. He opened the glove compartment, the center console, and even the trunk, tossing aside Marion's personal belongings as if they were nothing. Marion stood on the sidewalk, her hands clasped in front of her, her mind racing. She had never felt so humiliated, so powerless. After several minutes of searching, Holiday found nothing. There was no contraband, no weapons, no illegal items, just the belongings of an elderly woman on her way to visit her family. But instead of admitting he had made a mistake, Holiday grew more frustrated. His inability to find anything wrong only made him angrier, his pride wounded by the fact that his suspicions had been unfounded. Marion took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak up. "Officer, this isn't right," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "I know my rights, and you have no reason to detain me or search my car. I haven't done anything wrong." Holiday glared at her, his frustration boiling over. "You're resisting a lawful order," he snapped. "That's enough reason." Marion's eyes widened in disbelief. "Resisting? I've done nothing but cooperate with you. All I've asked for is an explanation." But Holiday wasn't listening. In his mind, Marion's refusal to simply submit without question was a form of resistance. He was used to people obeying his commands without hesitation, and the fact that Marion was standing up for herself only fueled his anger. Before Marion could react, Holiday grabbed her wrist, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The metal felt cold and harsh against her skin as he snapped them around her wrists with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," he declared, his voice cold and authoritative. Marion gasped, the shock of the situation overwhelming her. She had done nothing wrong. And yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to process what was happening. "Officer, please," she pleaded, trying to stay calm despite the panic rising within her. "This is a mistake. I haven't resisted you. I've done everything you've asked." But Holiday wasn't interested in her pleas. He was already leading her toward his police cruiser, his grip on her arm firm and unyielding. As he placed her in the back seat of the cruiser, Marion felt a wave of fear wash over her. What was going to happen to her? How had a simple drive to see her granddaughter turned into this nightmare? Sitting in the back seat of the police car, her hands cuffed in front of her, Marion felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She was scared, but she was also angry. Angry that she was being treated like this. Angry that, in the eyes of this police officer, she was guilty simply because of who she was. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, Marion took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't right. She knew it, and she wasn't going to let this officer get away with it. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "You have no idea who I am." Holiday snorted, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Oh, really? And who are you?" "Exactly." Marion met his gaze through the mirror, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I'm Marion Jackson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My son is Michael Jackson." For a moment, Holiday's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't expected that. The name alone carried weight, and for the first time since he had stopped Marion, he felt a flicker of doubt. But his pride quickly reasserted itself. Surely this woman was bluffing. She was just trying to use her family name to get out of trouble, and he wasn't about to let that happen. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning his attention back to the road. The drive to the police station was tense, with Marion sitting silently in the back of the cruiser, her hands still cuffed in front of her. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching as the streets passed by, trying to stay calm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. She had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this, arrested, treated like a criminal, simply for driving in the wrong neighborhood. The injustice of it all gnawed at her. But she reminded herself to stay composed. She would have her chance to explain, to defend herself, once they reached the station. Sergeant Holiday, on the other hand, was struggling to keep his own thoughts in check. The name Michael Jackson had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He wasn't a fan of the singer, but he knew enough about the cultural significance of that name to realize the potential gravity of his actions. But even now, his ego wouldn't allow him to believe that this elderly woman in the backseat was really the mother of the pop icon. He convinced himself that it was just another tactic, another way people tried to manipulate the system, to use their connections to escape the consequences of their actions. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he navigated through traffic, ignoring the occasional glance Marion gave him through the rearview mirror. In his mind, he was still in control. He was doing his job, upholding the law. That's what mattered. When they finally pulled into the station, Holliday parked the cruiser and stepped out without a word. He opened the back door and helped Marion out of the car, though not gently. Marion winced as the handcuffs dug into her wrists, but she said nothing. She had decided to let the situation play out, knowing that the truth would come to light eventually. Inside the station, a few officers glanced up as Holliday entered with Marion in tow. Some of them raised their eyebrows, surprised to see the sergeant bringing in an elderly woman. It wasn't something they saw every day, and it certainly didn't look like a high-stakes arrest. One of the younger officers, Officer Reed, approached them, his face reflecting a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Sergeant Holliday," Reed said, glancing between the sergeant and Marion. "What's going on here?" Holliday's expression remained stern. This woman was acting suspiciously in an upscale neighborhood. "She resisted my commands, and I have reason to believe she might be involved in something illegal." Reed looked at Marion, who stood calmly next to Holliday, her posture dignified despite the handcuffs. Something didn't feel right about the situation, but he wasn't in a position to question a superior officer. Instead, he nodded and gestured toward one of the holding cells. "Right this way, Ma'am," Reed said gently, guiding Marion toward the cell. Holliday watched as Marion was led away, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. His colleagues didn't seem to share his sense of urgency about the situation, and he couldn't help but notice the curious looks they were giving him. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had made his decision, and he wasn't about to back down now. As Marion was placed in the cell, she sat down on the bench inside, her hands still bound by the cuffs. She looked around the small, cold room, her heart heavy with the weight of the injustice she had just experienced. For the first time in years, she felt truly vulnerable, but she wasn't about to give up. Her son had taught her to stand tall, no matter what life threw her way. She had endured hardship before, and she would endure this, too. Meanwhile, back at the front desk, Holliday was filling out the arrest report, his frustration growing with each passing moment. He knew he had made a questionable call, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it, not yet. Anyway, he justified it in his head, replaying the events leading up to the arrest. She had resisted, hadn't she? She hadn't complied immediately. That was enough, right? As he was writing, the station's lieutenant, Lieutenant Hayes, approached the desk. A tall, commanding figure with years of experience under his belt, Hayes was known for his level-headedness and fairness. He glanced down at the report in front of Holliday, and then looked up at the sergeant with a raised eyebrow. "What's this?" Hayes asked, his voice calm but firm. Holliday didn't look up from the report. "Arrested a suspect in the new residential district. She was acting suspiciously and refused to cooperate. I had no choice but to detain her." Hayes frowned, leaning in to get a closer look at the report. "A suspect. Sergeant, this is a 72-year-old woman. What exactly did she do to warrant an arrest?" Holliday felt the weight of the lieutenant's gaze but kept his eyes on the paper. "She was in a neighborhood where she didn't belong. I had reason to believe she might be involved in something illegal." Hayes' frown deepened. Did she commit a crime? Or are we arresting people based on where they happen to be driving? Holliday's grip tightened on the pen. She resisted arrest. That's reason enough. Hayes sighed, his patience clearly being tested. I'll be the judge of that. Let me see her. Without waiting for a response, Hayes turned and headed toward the holding cells. Holliday hesitated for a moment, then followed, his stomach tightening with a sense of foreboding. As they approached the cell where Marion was being held, Hayes stopped in his tracks. There, sitting calmly on the bench, was the woman in question, but Hayes' eyes widened in recognition. He knew who she was. Marion Jackson Hayes stammered, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. Marion looked up, meeting his gaze with a tired but dignified expression. "Yes, Lieutenant Hayes, I'm Marion Jackson." Hayes turned to Holliday, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. "Do you have any idea who she is, Sergeant?" Holliday felt his heart sink. "She said something about being related to Michael Jackson, but I didn't believe her." Hayes stared at him in disbelief. "You didn't believe her? Sergeant, this is one of the most well-known women in the country. She's the mother of Michael Jackson. For God's sake, how could you not recognize her?" Holliday's face paled. He hadn't expected this. He had never imagined that this quiet, elderly woman could have such a powerful connection, and now he realized he had made a terrible mistake. Marion remained silent, watching the exchange between the two men. She didn't gloat or demand special treatment. That wasn't her way. But she knew that at this moment the tide had shifted in her favor. She didn't need to raise her voice, the truth was enough. Hayes turned back to Marion, his tone softening. "Mrs. Jackson, I am so sorry for what has happened here today. This is a grave misunderstanding, and I assure you we will make this right." Marion gave him a small nod. "Thank you, Lieutenant. But it's not about who I am, it's about how I was treated. No one should have to go through this, regardless of their status." Holliday stood frozen in place, his mind racing as the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. He had arrested the mother of a global superstar, and now his entire career could be on the line. His pride, his prejudice, it had all led him here, to this moment of reckoning. Lieutenant Holliday began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize." Hayes cut him off with a sharp glance. "That's the problem, Sergeant. You didn't realize, and now we're going to have to deal with the fallout." As Hayes turned to walk away, Holliday's thoughts swirled. He had made a terrible error in judgment, one that could cost him everything. But it wasn't just his career he was worried about now, it was the fact that he had treated someone so unfairly, so unjustly, based solely on his own assumptions. And the worst part was, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. Marion sat quietly in the cell, her hands still cuffed, waiting for the next steps. She didn't gloat, she didn't demand, but deep down, she knew that this moment had the potential to change something far greater than just her immediate circumstances. As Lieutenant Hayes instructed one of the younger officers to release Marion from the cell, Sergeant Holliday stood frozen in place, grappling with the weight of what he had just learned. The blood drained from his face as Hayes turned to address him. "Sergeant Holliday," the lieutenant began, his voice stern but controlled, "I want you to understand that this is more than just a misjudgment on your part. This is a serious incident. We have arrested and detained the mother of one of the most well-known figures in the world. If the press gets wind of this, it won't just be you in trouble, it'll be the entire department." Holliday swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his hips. "I didn't know, Lieutenant," he muttered, but the words felt hollow even to him. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Hayes replied sharply. "You made assumptions. And now we're all going to have to deal with the fallout from those assumptions." As Marion was released from the cell, the officers were careful not to treat her like a prisoner anymore. The cuffs were removed from her wrists with great care, and Officer Reed offered her an apologetic smile as he helped her to a chair in the station's front office. Marion accepted the assistance with grace, though the weight of the situation was clear in her weary expression. As she sat, Marion felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The ordeal had taken a toll on her more than she wanted to admit. Her joints ached from the tension, and the stress had begun to manifest in the form of a dull pain spreading across her chest. But Marion wasn't one to complain. She had lived through much worse in her life, and this was just another challenge she would overcome. Still, the reality of what had just happened lingered in her mind. It wasn't just about the fact that she had been arrested, it was about the way she had been treated. the way her very presence had been deemed suspicious simply because of who she was and where she was driving. Marion knew that even if she wasn't the mother of a famous figure, she still deserved respect. Everyone did. Sergeant Holliday, standing a few feet away, watched her with a sense of growing dread. The name Jackson echoed in his mind, and the implications of his actions became clearer by the second. He had treated this woman like a criminal based on nothing but his own biased assumptions, and now it seemed like the entire world was about to come crashing down around him. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward, his face a mixture of professional composure and frustration. "Mrs. Jackson," he began, his voice softer than before, "I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for what you've been through today. This never should have happened." Marion, still rubbing her wrists where the handcuffs had left faint red marks, nodded slightly. "I understand, Lieutenant," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "But the truth is, this isn't just about today. This is something that happens far too often. People like me are seen as a threat for simply existing in spaces where others think we don't belong." Her words hung in the air, and Holliday felt each one like a blow to his conscience. He had never considered himself a racist. He had convinced himself that he was simply upholding the law, doing his duty. But now, confronted with the reality of his actions, he couldn't deny the ugly truth that lay beneath the surface. He had been wrong deeply, inexcusably wrong. Marion continued, her gaze steady as she addressed the room. "I'm not interested in making this a spectacle. I don't need headlines or lawsuits. But I do need to know that something will change, because if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." Lieutenant Hayes nodded gravely, understanding the weight of her words. "We will conduct a full investigation into this matter," he assured her, "and Sergeant Holliday will be held accountable for his actions. I can promise you that." Marion glanced at Holliday, her eyes calm but unwavering. She could see the guilt written all over his face, the way his hands fidgeted, the way his jaw tightened. He wasn't a monster, she thought, just a man who had allowed his prejudices to guide him. That didn't excuse what he had done, but she could see that he was beginning to realize the gravity of his actions. Suddenly, Marion felt a sharp pain shoot through her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. Her hand instinctively went to her chest as her face twisted in discomfort. Officer Reed, standing nearby, noticed immediately and rushed to her side. "Mrs. Jackson, are you okay?" he asked, concern filling his voice. Marion tried to wave him off, but the pain was too intense to ignore. It's just stress," she whispered, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "I'll be fine." But it was clear that she wasn't fine. The color drained from her face, and her body began to tremble as the pain intensified. Reed quickly called for an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics arrived at the station, rushing to Marion's side. Sergeant Holliday watched in horror as the scene unfolded in front of him. This was all his fault. He had caused this. The weight of his guilt was almost unbearable as he stood there, helpless, watching Marion being loaded onto a stretcher and rushed toward the waiting ambulance. Lieutenant Hayes turned to Holliday, his expression unreadable. "You'd better pray that she's going to be okay, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice laced with disappointment. Holliday said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had crossed a line, and now he was facing the consequences. The woman he had wrongfully arrested was now in the hospital because of him. How could he ever make that right? As the ambulance sped away, Holliday stood alone in the parking lot, his mind racing with regret. He had spent his entire career believing that he was the good guy, the one who kept people safe, the one who upheld the law. But now, for the first time, he realized that he had been blind to his own prejudices, and that blindness had nearly cost a woman her life. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The station felt unusually quiet, as though the tension of the day had cast a pall over everything. Holliday remained at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him, though his mind was miles away. He couldn't stop thinking about Marion, about what might happen to her, about what he had done. Just as the clock neared midnight, The station phone rang, breaking the silence. Officer Reed answered it, his face tightening as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. After a few moments, he hung up and turned to the room. "Mrs. Jackson is in stable condition," he announced, relief evident in his voice. "The doctors say she had a stress-induced cardiac event, but she's going to be okay." The tension in the room lifted slightly at the news, but for Holliday the relief was short-lived. He knew that Marian's recovery didn't absolve him of his actions. He had caused her stress, had treated her like a criminal based on nothing but his own biases, and now he would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. As the news of Marian's condition spread, the station began to return to its usual rhythm, but for Holliday, nothing felt normal anymore. He sat at his desk, staring at the phone, his mind a whirl of guilt and self-reflection. He thought about his career, about the countless arrests he had made, about the way he had treated people who didn't look like him. He had always believed that he was upholding justice, but now he couldn't help but wonder how many times he had let his biases cloud his judgment. The next morning, Holliday made a decision. He had to make things right, as best as he could. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could apologize. He could face Marian and acknowledge the harm he had caused. And maybe, just maybe, that would be a step toward redemption. Dressed in his uniform, but feeling the weight of shame pressing down on him, Holliday made his way to the hospital where Marian was recovering. As he approached her room, his heart raced with anxiety. He wasn't sure what he would say, or how she would react, but he knew that he owed her this apology. When he entered the room, he saw Marian sitting up in bed, her expression calm but weary. Her son, Michael Jackson, was sitting next to her, his face a mask of concern as he held his mother's hand. The sight of the famous musician made Holliday's heart skip a beat, but he pushed his nerves aside. This wasn't about Michael, it was about Marian. Marian looked up as Holliday entered, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. For a moment there was silence as the two of them regarded each other, and then Holliday cleared his throat. "Mrs. Jackson," he began, his voice shaking slightly. I came here to apologize. For everything." Michael looked up, his expression guarded, but Marian raised a hand to stop him from speaking. She kept her focus on Holliday, listening intently as he struggled to find the right words. "I was wrong," Holliday continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong to arrest you. I was wrong to assume the worst. I let my own biases guide my actions, and because of that you ended up here. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know how sorry I am." Marian studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Holliday felt the weight of her gaze, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly humbled. Finally, Marian spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Sergeant, I appreciate your apology, but like I told your lieutenant, this isn't just about me. This is about something much bigger. If you truly want to make amends, then you need to start by looking inside yourself and understanding why you did what you did. And then you need to work to change it, not just for me, but for everyone." Holliday nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a lifetime of assumptions, of unconscious prejudices that had shaped the way he saw the world, and if he wanted to make things right, he would have to start by confronting those parts of himself. "I will," he promised, his voice breaking slightly. "I will work to change." Sergeant Holliday left the hospital with Marian Jackson's words echoing in his mind. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he knew that his apology alone was not enough. Marian had been right. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had faced similar prejudice and mistreatment. For Holliday, the road to redemption would be long, and it would begin with confronting the uncomfortable truths he had ignored for most of his life. But as much as Holliday wrestled with his conscience, the repercussions of his actions were already spiraling beyond his control. News of Marian Jackson's wrongful arrest had reached the media, and within hours, headlines about the incident had exploded across social media and news outlets. The public was outraged that the mother of Michael Jackson, a beloved figure across generations, had been treated with such disrespect and suspicion. In the days following the incident, protests began to form outside the police station, demanding justice for Marion and calling for Sergeant Holliday's immediate suspension. What had started as a quiet demonstration quickly grew into a large gathering, with activists holding signs that read, "Justice for Marion and end police prejudice." The situation was escalating rapidly, and it was clear that the public would not rest until there was accountability. Inside the station, the tension was palpable. Officers who had once respected Holliday now avoided eye contact with him, whispering behind his back as they passed by. Lieutenant Hayes had called for an internal investigation, and Holliday knew that his days on the force might be numbered. Despite his long service and clean record, this incident had changed everything. His reputation was in shambles, and no amount of denial could erase the fact that he had allowed his prejudices to guide his actions. As the protests grew louder outside, Holliday sat in the briefing room, waiting for a disciplinary meeting with the department's higher-ups. His mind raced with the consequences he might face: suspension, demotion, or even termination. Worse than that, though, was the realization that his career, built on the belief that he was a protector of justice, had been tainted by his own biases. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Lieutenant Hayes entered, followed by Chief O'Donnell, a no-nonsense veteran officer with decades of experience. Chief O'Donnell's face was grim as he took a seat at the head of the table, gesturing for Holliday to sit as well. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Holliday could feel the weight of their scrutiny on him. "Holliday," Chief O'Donnell began, his voice measured but stern. "You know why we're here?" Holliday nodded, unable to meet the chief's gaze. "Yes, sir." O'Donnell let out a heavy sigh, folding his hands on the table. "We've reviewed the body cam footage, spoken to witnesses, and assessed the situation. Your actions, your arrest of Mrs. Jackson, were not only unjustified, they were a clear abuse of power. You racially profiled her, and that's something we cannot and will not tolerate in this department." Holliday felt his stomach drop. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he knew they were true. He had acted on his own prejudices, and now he was facing the consequences. "There's going to be an external investigation," O'Donnell said. "The City Civilian Review Board is already involved, and they're calling for transparency. But in the meantime, you're suspended without pay, effective immediately." The silence in the room was deafening. Holliday's heart pounded in his chest, the reality of his suspension sinking in. His career, his livelihood, everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. But worse than that was the realization that he had caused harm, real harm, to an innocent woman. "I understand," Chief Holliday said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know I was wrong. I don't know how I let it get this far." O'Donnell studied him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. "Look, Holliday, we all make mistakes, but this wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of judgment. If you ever want to come back to this force, you're going to have to prove that you've changed. That starts with acknowledging the biases that led you to this point." Holliday nodded, his throat tight. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. As the meeting came to a close, he stood and left the room, his suspension weighing heavily on him. But even as he walked through the station, the protests outside continued to grow louder. The people weren't just calling for his suspension, they were calling for systemic change. The next few days were a blur for Holliday. The media frenzy around Marion's wrongful arrest continued to dominate headlines, and every news outlet was covering the story from different angles. Some focused on the injustice Marion had faced, while others delved into the broader issue of racial profiling within the police force. Interviews with civil rights activists, former officers, and legal experts filled the airwaves, all calling for reform and accountability. Meanwhile, Marion's condition in the hospital had stabilized, but she remained under observation due to the stress-induced cardiac event. Her son, Michael Jackson had made a brief statement to the press, expressing his relief that his mother was recovering, but condemning the actions of the police department. He called for justice, not just for his mother, but for all those who had been subjected to similar treatment. Holliday, now isolated and suspended from duty, watched the news unfold from his small apartment. The once proud sergeant now found himself on the wrong side of public opinion, his face plastered across television screens as the embodiment of everything wrong with modern policing. It was a harsh and painful lesson, but one he knew he had to learn. One evening, as Holliday sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the TV, there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he hesitated to answer. But as the knock came again, more insistent this time, he rose and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Michael Jackson standing on his doorstep. The man who had once been a distant, untouchable figure, known only through his music and media appearances, now stood before Holliday with an intense, unreadable expression. "Mr. Jackson," Holliday stammered, caught off guard. I wasn't expecting." Michael raised a hand to cut him off. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Sergeant Holliday. I'm here because we need to talk." Holliday stepped aside, allowing Michael to enter his modest apartment. The atmosphere between them was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of purpose in Michael's demeanor that Holliday couldn't ignore. "I know what you did to my mother," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with underlying anger. "And I know you've been suspended. But what I need to know is if you really understand the gravity of what you've done." Holliday nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do. I know I was wrong. I know I let my own biases get in the way, and I'm sorry. But I know that doesn't fix anything." Michael's eyes narrowed as he studied Holliday. "You're right. It doesn't fix anything, but what my mother said to you in the hospital about change, it wasn't just for show. She believes in people's ability to change, and so do I, but that change has to come from within. You've got a lot of work to do, Sergeant, and it's not going to happen overnight." Holliday felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected to be having this conversation with Michael Jackson, of all people, but the man's words hit home in a way that nothing else had. "I know I can't undo what I did," Holliday said quietly, "but I want to make it right. I just don't know how." Michael nodded slowly. "The first step is acknowledging your mistakes, and you've done that. But the second step is taking action. You need to learn. You need to listen, and you need to be part of the solution, not the problem." Holliday felt a flicker of hope, though it was tempered by the enormity of what lay ahead. "What do you suggest?" Michael looked him in the eye, his expression firm. "Start by educating yourself. Attend the community meetings. Listen to the people who've been affected by police prejudice. And when the time comes, you need to step up and be a voice for change within the department. That's how you can make things right." Holliday nodded, the path ahead becoming clearer, though no less daunting. "I will," he promised, his voice steady with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." Michael held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Good, because this isn't just about my mother. It's about all of us." With that, Michael turned and left the apartment, leaving Holliday standing alone, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The road ahead would be long, and redemption wouldn't come easily. But for the first time in his life, Holliday understood that change wasn't just necessary, it was the only way forward. Sergeant Holliday knew the days ahead would be difficult, but nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude of the backlash that followed the news of Marion Jackson's wrongful arrest. In the weeks since the incident, the city had become a battleground of conflicting voices. Protests swirled outside the police station every day, with activists demanding justice for Marion and systemic change within the department. On the other side, some officers in the department, particularly those who had worked alongside Holliday for years, stood behind him in quiet solidarity, believing that he had simply made a mistake, one that didn't warrant the harsh punishment of suspension. They couldn't see, or refused to see, the deeper issue at hand: racial profiling, a problem that had become deeply embedded in law enforcement culture. But Holliday couldn't deny it anymore. He had to face his demons head-on if he was ever going to redeem himself. His suspension dragged on, and during this time, Holliday did as Michael Jackson had advised. He attended community meetings, initially sitting in the back, unsure of how he would be received. But over time, he began to engage with the discussions, listening to the stories of those who had been marginalized, targeted, and treated unfairly by the very people sworn to protect them. He heard stories that echoed Marion's experience, and each one deepened his understanding of the systemic problems within policing. As he sat through meeting after meeting, Holliday felt a slow, painful shift in his perspective. These were the voices he had ignored for years, dismissed as exaggerations or isolated incidents. Now, he couldn't turn away from them. The injustice was real, and he had been a part of it. But there was something else Holliday noticed in these meetings: hope. Despite everything, there was a sense of possibility, a belief that change could come if people were willing to fight for it. And for the first time in his career, Holliday felt that he could be part of that change. One afternoon, after one of the meetings, Marion Jackson herself approached Holliday. She had been discharged from the hospital and had recovered from her stress-induced cardiac event, though the physical and emotional toll was still evident. She looked at Holliday with the same calm intensity she had shown him in the police station, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I see you've been coming to these meetings," Marion said, her voice soft but strong. "You've been listening." Holliday nodded, unable to hide the guilt in his eyes. "I have," he replied quietly. "I've learned a lot, more than I ever thought I would." Marion studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good listening is the first step. But you've got a long way to go, Sergeant." Holliday swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. I've been thinking about everything I've done, everything I've believed, and I know I have to do more. I want to be part of the solution." Marion's expression softened slightly. "That's what I hope to hear. Change doesn't come from sitting back and watching. It comes from standing up and doing something, even when it's hard." Before Holliday could respond, the room around them erupted in a new wave of activity. The media had gotten wind of Marion's appearance at the community meeting, and reporters were beginning to gather outside, eager to get a statement from her. The attention made Holliday uncomfortable. He didn't want this to become a spectacle. He wasn't ready to be in the spotlight. Not yet. But Marion seemed unfazed by the growing crowd. She had lived her life under the public eye, and this was no different. As Marion made her way to the door, she paused and looked back at Holliday. "Remember what I said, Sergeant. Change takes work. Don't just talk about it. Do something." Holliday nodded again, her words echoing in his mind long after she had left. He had spent years enforcing the law, but now he realized that enforcing justice required something deeper: empathy, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his mistakes. He had to take action. That evening, Holliday sat in his small apartment, reflecting on the path ahead. He knew that regaining the trust of the community wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and a genuine commitment to change. But where would he start? He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future, and that thought gave him a glimmer of hope. Days later, Holliday received a letter from the department. It was a notice that the external investigation had been completed, and he was to appear before a disciplinary board to determine his future in the force. The board would review the findings of the investigation, including witness statements, body cam footage, and Holliday's own account of the incident. He knew this would be a defining moment in his career, possibly the end of it. But no matter what happened, he was determined to face it head-on, without excuses. The day of the hearing arrived, and as Holliday entered the police station, he felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The building, once so familiar, now felt cold and distant. He had spent years here, building a career that he had been proud of, but now it felt like the walls were closing in on him. The disciplinary board was made up of a panel of senior officers, including Chief O'Donnell and several members of the Civilian Review Board des Piat. Behind a long table in a stark, windowless room, Holliday stood before them, hands clasped in front of him, his posture tense but controlled. Sergeant Holliday, Chief O'Donnell began, his voice even but stern. We've reviewed the findings of the investigation, and we're here today to discuss your actions regarding the wrongful arrest of Marion Jackson. Holliday took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. He had known this day would arrive, and now all he could do was be honest. O'Donnell continued, "Before we proceed with the disciplinary process, we'd like to hear from you directly. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Holliday hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "Chief, members of the board," he began, his voice steady but somber, "I won't stand here and make excuses for what I did. I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and because of that, I treated an innocent woman like a criminal. I can't change what happened, but I can promise you that I've learned from my mistakes." He paused, searching for the right words. "Since the incident, I've attended community meetings. I've listened to the people who've been affected by police prejudice, and I've come to understand just how deep the problem runs. It's not just about one arrest, it's about a system that's been failing people for years. I want to be part of the change that's needed. I want to work to rebuild the trust I've broken, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen." The room was silent for a moment as the members of the board exchanged glances. O'Donnell leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "You've been a part of this department for over 2 decades, Holliday. You've had a clean record up until now, and that speaks to your abilities as an officer. But this incident has brought to light some serious concerns not just about you, but about the culture of this department. We can't ignore that." Holliday nodded, knowing that he was facing a reckoning not just for his own actions but for the broader issues within law enforcement. The Civilian Review Board has recommended a suspension without pay, pending further evaluation, O'Donnell continued. In addition, they've suggested that you undergo mandatory bias training and work directly with community outreach programs aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Holliday felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end of his career, not yet. There was still a chance to make things right, but he knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult road. "I accept the board's recommendations," Holliday said firmly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I've changed." O'Donnell nodded, the tension in the room easing slightly. "Very well. We'll reconvene after your suspension period to assess your progress. In the meantime, I suggest you take this opportunity to reflect on the responsibilities that come with wearing that badge." With that, the hearing was adjourned, and Holliday left the room feeling both humbled and determined. The suspension would be difficult, but it was a necessary step in his journey toward redemption. In the weeks that followed, Holliday threw himself into community outreach programs. He volunteered at local shelters, attended neighborhood meetings, and worked closely with activists who were pushing for police reform. It was hard work, emotionally draining and often frustrating, but it was also rewarding. For the first time in his life, Holliday was seeing the world from a different perspective, one that had been invisible to him for so long. He also underwent mandatory bias training, where he was forced to confront the unconscious prejudices that had shaped his behavior. It wasn't easy. Holliday had spent years believing he was one of the good guys, and now he had to come to terms with the fact that he had been part of the problem. But he was determined to change, and he approached the training with an open mind, knowing that this was his chance to become a better officer and a better person. Throughout his suspension, Holliday remained in contact with Marion. The two of them had developed an unlikely friendship, forged in the aftermath of a painful experience. Marion continued to offer him guidance and support, but she never let him forget the importance of his responsibility. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she reminded him one day, "but it can happen if you're willing to put in the work." Holliday nodded, her words resonating deeply with him. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he was on the right path. Months had passed since Sergeant Holliday's suspension, and the city had begun to calm after the media storm surrounding Marion Jackson's arrest. The protests had subsided, but the conversations sparked by the incident continued to ripple through the community, inspiring more discussions about police reform and systemic change. Holliday's journey during his suspension had been transformative. The bias training had opened his eyes to the unconscious prejudices he had carried for so long, and the time he spent in community outreach programs had given him a new perspective on the people he had once sworn to protect. He had spent hours listening to stories, hearing the pain in people's voices as they recounted their own experiences with injustice. Through it all, Marion had been a constant presence in his life, offering him advice, encouragement, and a challenge to continue growing. One quiet afternoon, as the sun began to set over the city, Holliday found himself walking through the very neighborhood where he had first encountered Marion. It was strange to think how much had changed since that day. The upscale homes and pristine lawns still looked the same, but his view of the world had shifted dramatically. He no longer saw people as threats based on their appearance or where they happened to be driving. Instead, he saw a community filled with individuals who deserved respect, fairness, and dignity regardless of race, age, or background. As Holliday approached Marion's house, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for most of his career. He had spent so many years believing that enforcing the law meant being rigid, unyielding, and suspicious. But now he understood that true justice required compassion, understanding, and the ability to admit when you were wrong. Marion greeted him at the door with a warm smile. She had fully recovered from her hospital stay, and though the ordeal had taken a toll on her, she remained as strong and wise as ever. "Good to see you, Sergeant," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Or should I say James? I think we're past titles at this point." Holliday chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess we are." They sat together on her front porch, the late afternoon sunlight casting a golden glow over the quiet street. For a moment they didn't speak, just sat in comfortable silence, both reflecting on how far they had come. "I never thought I'd see the day when a police officer would be sitting here on my porch, asking for advice," Marion said with a smile, breaking the silence. Holliday smiled back, but there was a seriousness in his expression. "You changed my life, Marion. I didn't realize how blind I'd been, but you helped me see things differently." Marion looked at him thoughtfully. "I didn't change your life, James, you did that yourself. All I did was give you a little push in the right direction. The real work came from you." Holliday nodded, humbled by her words. "I know I still have a long way to go. There's a lot more to learn, and a lot more to change, but I'm committed to it now. I don't want to go back to the way things were." Marion placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "That's all anyone can ask for, James, the willingness to change, to do better. It's not easy, but it's the only way forward." As they sat together, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, Holliday felt a sense of closure. He wasn't the same man he had been months ago, and he never would be again. The old version of himself, the one who had operated out of fear, suspicion, and prejudice, was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned to listen, to reflect, and to grow. The police department had reinstated him, though his role had changed. No longer a street officer, Holliday had taken on a new position within the department, working directly with community outreach and reform initiatives. His days were now spent building bridges between the police and the community, working to repair the trust that had been broken. It wasn't always easy, but it was the right thing to do. As the sun finally set, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, Holliday stood to leave. He turned to Marion, a sense of gratitude welling up inside him. "Thank you, Marion," he said softly, "for everything." Marion smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "You're welcome. James, just remember, change doesn't stop here. It's a lifelong journey." Holliday nodded, her words resonating deeply. He knew that his journey wasn't over, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. And with people like Marion by his side, guiding him when he needed it most, he knew that he could make a difference not just for himself, but for the community he served. As he walked away from her house, Holiday felt the weight of his past lift from his shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time he felt hopeful. He had faced his mistakes, learned from them, and was committed to being part of the change that the world so desperately needed. And in that moment, as he walked into the twilight, James Holiday knew that he had taken the first steps toward becoming the man he was always meant to be.